The moment the older man in the Legion Hall saw the patch in my hand, he stopped mid-sentence. He'd been talking to someone beside him, laughing about something, and then his eyes dropped to what I was holding and everything about him went still, not startled, not confused. Still, like a person who had just seen something they never expected to see again. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Careful. The kind of quiet that doesn't match a noisy Legion Hall on a Friday evening in November. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away in September." The man looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "We need to sit down." That was the night I found out my grandfather, the man my own parents had dismissed as a relic of another era, the man who died in a hospital room with only me beside him, had not been who any of us thought he was. My grandfather's name was Raymond. He grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, one of 5 children in a family that didn't have much and didn't expect much from the world. He was quiet in a way that some people mistake for dullness. He never raised his voice. He laughed at small things, a cardinal landing on the fence, a particularly bad hockey call. He lived alone in a small bungalow in the east end of Hamilton after my grandmother passed, the kind of house with a narrow driveway and a garden that he kept tidy without making a fuss about it. My parents, when they thought about him at all, thought about inconvenience. That sounds harsh. I've tried to find a softer way to say it, but the truth is, they kept him at arm's length the way people keep a difficult task at arm's length, always meaning to get to it, never quite finding the moment. He wasn't demanding. He didn't call and complain. He didn't show up at the door unannounced. He just existed quietly on the edge of our lives, and they let him stay there. I was 28 when he collapsed. It was a Tuesday in August, and I was at work in Ottawa, halfway through a shift at the military base where I serve as a logistics officer with the Canadian Armed Forces. My phone rang. It was a woman named Mrs. Debrescu, his next-door neighbor, who had his number in her phone from the time he'd helped her son carry furniture. She told me he'd been taken to Hamilton General. She told me she'd been trying to reach my parents for 2 hours. I called my parents from the parking lot. My mother answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what Mrs. Debrescu had told me. There was a pause. "How serious is it?" she asked. I said I didn't know yet. I said someone needed to go. Another pause. "Your uncle could probably check in," she said. "We have the Hargreaves dinner tonight, and I don't know that driving all the way to Hamilton on short notice." I had already ended the call before she finished. I drove 4.5 hours that night. Got to the hospital around midnight. The floor was quiet, that specific middle-of-the-night hospital quiet that has a texture to it, like the building itself is holding its breath. A nurse took me to his room, and when I pushed the door open, my grandfather was awake. Tubes, monitors, the pale greenish light of machines. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked at me for a moment before he smiled. "You came a long way," he said. I told him I hadn't. I told him it was nothing. He shook his head slowly. "Your parents?" I said they'd been tied up. I said they'd come soon. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with those tired eyes, and I knew he didn't believe me, and I knew he wasn't going to make me admit it. He had always done that, absorbed the hard things quietly, so no one else had to hold them. He didn't recover. I stayed 3 days, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, eating vending machine sandwiches, talking to him when he was awake and sitting with him when he wasn't. My parents came on the 4th day, the day after he slipped into the kind of sleep he didn't come back from. They stood in the doorway of his room, looking uncomfortable. My mother straightened a pillow that didn't need straightening. He died on a Thursday morning while I was in the room. It was the quietest thing I have ever witnessed. One breath, and then the absence of breath, and the monitors making a sound they weren't supposed to make. My parents handled the practical details efficiently. I'll give them that. Within a week, they had contacted a funeral home, made arrangements for the cremation, and put together a guest list that was 3 pages shorter than it should have been. The service was small. The Legion sent a wreath. A few old neighbors came. My uncle was there. My parents stood near the front, looking appropriately solemn. I was the one who went back to his house to sort through his things. It took several weekends. Most of it was ordinary. The slow accumulation of a man's life, the hardware store receipts, and the jars of hardware and the cookbooks he'd used until the spines gave out. He had a collection of hockey programs going back to the 1970s. He had a row of paperbacks on a shelf above the television, all of them worn smooth from reading. I found the patch in his dresser drawer, underneath the folded Canadian flag, that someone had given him a long time ago. It wasn't much to look at. A small embroidered thing, no bigger than my palm, dark green, with a shape on it that I didn't recognize. Not a maple leaf, not a regimental badge, not anything I could place. I'd never seen him wear it, but I'd seen him hold it. Once, when I was maybe 10 years old, I'd walked into his kitchen and found him sitting at the table with this thing in his hand, just looking at it. He'd put it in his shirt pocket when he saw me come in and changed the subject, so naturally I'd forgotten about it until now. I took it with me when I drove back to Ottawa. I didn't know why exactly. It just seemed wrong to leave it. I wore my grandfather's old field jacket to the Legion Remembrance event in November. He'd left it to me years ago in one of those casual offhand ways he had. That old thing's too big for me now, you take it. The patch was in the inside pocket. I'd put it there without really thinking. The Legion Hall in Ottawa was full that evening. The usual crowd, veterans, family members, a handful of younger people who come with grandparents or great-grandparents. I've been to events like this enough times to know the rhythms. Speeches. Oh, Canada. The silence. The Legion seniors who stood a little straighter than their bodies probably allowed. I was talking to a woman I'd met the previous year when I noticed the man watching me from across the room. He was in his late 70s, I guessed. Tall, even now, with the posture of someone who'd spent a long time being required to stand correctly. He was wearing a blazer covered in pins and ribbons. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I reached into my pocket for my phone, the patch came out with it and landed on the table. The man was beside me before I'd even picked it up. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More like the words fell out of him before he decided to say them. I told him it had been my grandfather's. I told him my grandfather's name. The man's face did something complicated. He said, "Raymond Thibault." Not a question either. "You knew him?" I asked. He looked at me for a long time. "Let me get us some coffee," he said. "This is gonna take a while." His name was Douglas Mathers, and he had served alongside my grandfather for 11 years in a capacity that he described carefully as administrative liaison work for a federal security directorate. It took me a few minutes to understand what he was actually saying. And what he was saying was that my grandfather had spent a decade doing things for the government of Canada that the government of Canada did not, technically, acknowledge having done. "What kind of things?" I asked. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "The kind that don't show up in any personnel file," he said, "and aren't mentioned in any parliamentary record, and weren't talked about then, and won't be talked about now. The kind where the people doing them understood from the beginning that they'd never be credited." I thought about my grandfather sitting at his kitchen table with that patch in his hand. "What is the patch?" I asked. Douglas looked at it for a moment. "An identifier," he said, "for people who were read into a specific program. Most of them were destroyed when the program was wound down. He kept his." "Why would he keep it?" Douglas was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "because it was the only proof he had that it happened." I drove back to my apartment that night thinking about my grandfather and all the things he'd never told me. Not just the program, whatever it was. The whole of it. He moved through his life so quietly. He fixed things when they broke. He grew tomatoes in the summer. He called me on my birthday every year without fail and always asked what I was reading. He made proper tuhaya at Christmas and gave half of it away to Mrs. Dobreshu. He went to the Legion on Friday nights and sat with men he'd known for 40 years. And somewhere underneath all of that was something else. A whole other layer of his life that he'd folded up and put away and never taken out again. I called my mother the next morning. I told her about the Legion, about Douglas, about what he'd said. There was a silence on her end. Then she said, "I'm sure there's an innocent explanation." I said that was an unusual thing to call it. "He was always making things seem more dramatic than they were," she said. "He once told you kids he'd met the Prime Minister and it turned out to be at some municipal ribbon cutting." "He probably did meet the Prime Minister," I said. She scoffed. "My father was worse. He didn't call it dramatic. He called it sad." "Your grandfather spent a long time," he said, measuring his words, "needing to feel like he mattered. That's understandable for a man his age. But I'd be careful about taking everything seriously." "He saved lives," I said. "That's what Douglas told me." "Douglas is an old man in a Legion Hall," my father said. What did you expect him to say? I thought about my grandfather lying in that hospital bed, about the nurse who'd asked if we expected more family to come, about my parents at the dinner party on the night he was taken in. I didn't argue. I hung up. I'd known, growing up, that my grandfather was treated as a minor character in the family story. He came to Christmas if invited, which he usually was, but not always. My parents never took us to visit him in Hamilton without a specific reason. My father once said, when he thought I wasn't listening, that the old man had always been more interested in his other life than in being a proper part of the family. I'd assumed he meant the Legion, the volunteer work, the friends. It hadn't occurred to me to wonder what else he might mean. I started making calls, quietly, not officially. I had colleagues in Ottawa who knew people, the way people in the military know people, in concentric circles of connection. I described the patch to a retired officer I'd worked with during a training rotation in Ottawa. He went silent in a specific way. Then he said he wanted to call me back from a different phone. He called back 20 minutes later. "Where did you say you found it?" he asked. "In my grandfather's dresser," I said. Another silence. "Those programs were shut down in the early 90s, he said. "There's almost no documentation. People who were part of them were asked to consider it a permanent confidentiality arrangement." I asked what the patch identified. "People who were cleared for cross-departmental intelligence work," he said, "between CSIS precursors and military intelligence, in the years before there was a formal structure for that kind of coordination. Off-book. Deniable. The people who did it were chosen because they were good at disappearing into the background." That phrase hit me like something physical. Disappearing into the background. My grandfather had done that his whole life. I had thought it was just his personality. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Douglas Mathers. He'd spoken with 2 other men from the program, both still living, and they had agreed to meet with me. One was in Kingston. One had driven up from Guelph. We met at the Legion in Hamilton, the one my grandfather had attended for 30 years. The man from Kingston was named Fletcher. The man from Guelph didn't give me a name, just nodded when I came in and said he'd known Raymond. Fletcher put a folder on the table. "I can't share anything classified," he said, "and most of what we did is still technically classified, so I won't, but I can tell you what kind of man your grandfather was." He described a person I recognized and didn't recognize at the same time. Reliable. Patient. The kind of person who could wait in a parked car for 6 hours without complaint. The kind of person who could meet someone at a border crossing and make them feel safe enough to say things they hadn't said to anyone else. He had a gift, Fletcher said, for making people feel seen, for listening without agenda. He was also one of the best people I ever knew at not being remembered, the unnamed man said. We'd debrief after an operation, and people would describe the person who'd helped them, and they'd say things like, quiet, medium height, friendly, Canadian. That was Raymond. He was completely unplaceable, and that was what made him effective. I sat with that for a moment. "Did he ever talk about his family?" I asked. Fletcher smiled. "He talked about you," he said, "his granddaughter in the military. He was very proud." My throat tightened. "Did he talk about my parents?" A pause. "He said they found him hard to understand," Fletcher said carefully. "He said he didn't blame them." On the drive back to Ottawa, I thought about all the things my grandfather had never asked for. He'd never asked for a bigger funeral. He'd never asked my parents to come to the hospital faster. He'd never told me in any of our conversations that he was lonely, even though I think he was. He just kept going. Kept feeding the birds and growing the tomatoes and making the tortilla and calling me on my birthday. He'd spent his whole professional life making sure other people were okay. And then he'd come home and done the same thing for his family without anyone knowing, without asking for anything back. That weekend, I drove to my parents' house. I didn't tell them I was coming. I pulled into the driveway on a Saturday afternoon and knocked on the door. And when my mother opened it, she looked surprised and then composed herself into a welcoming expression. I sat down at the kitchen table where we'd had 100 Sunday dinners. I put the folder of photos Douglas had given me on the table. Old photographs, the kind with the date printed in orange on the corner. My grandfather in his 30s, unsmiling, in the company of people I didn't recognize in places that looked like government buildings. And then I put the patch beside the photos. And I put down a photocopy of a letter that Fletcher had given me, A letter that had been written to my grandfather in 1987 from a department head whose name had been redacted, thanking him, in careful bureaucratic language, for service that could not be publicly recognized. My father picked up the letter. He read it slowly. "Read it again." "Where did you get this?" he asked. "From the men he served with," I said. "From the people he spent 10 years helping, who are still alive to talk about it." My mother had both hands around her coffee mug. She wasn't drinking from it. "Why didn't he tell us?" she asked. "Because you never asked," I thought. But what I said was, he wasn't allowed to. And because he wanted to protect you from carrying something that was his to carry. My father put the letter down and looked at the table for a long time. He drove a 15-year-old Civic, he said, not accusing, not defending, just remembering. I used to think he could have done more with himself. He did everything with himself, I said. He just couldn't tell you. Nobody talked for a while. Then my mother said something I hadn't expected. She said, "I knew something was different about him. When I was young, before I married your father, I used to feel it. There was something behind the quiet. I just decided it wasn't worth understanding." That was the first time she'd said anything like that. The first time she'd admitted she'd made a choice, not just an oversight. My father looked up from the table. "I want to do something," he said. "Proper. Not a big production, but something." There was a small ceremony the following spring. Not military, not official. Just people who'd known Raymond Thibault gathering at the Hamilton Legion on a Sunday afternoon. Mrs. Debrescu came. Fletcher came. Douglas came, with a cane he hadn't had in November. The unnamed man from Guelph came and still didn't give his name. Some of the regulars from the Legion were there, men who'd sat with my grandfather on Friday evenings for 20 years and known him without knowing him. My father spoke. He didn't try to be eloquent. He stood up at the front with his hands at his sides and said that he had spent a long time not knowing his own father, and that the not knowing had been a choice, and that he was going to spend the rest of his time making different choices. He sat down. My mother was crying quietly. There were no medals, no folded flag, no formal honors, just people who had loved him in various ways saying so. I was the last one at the grave. I stood there for a while with the patch in my hand. The cemetery was quiet, the way Hamilton goes quiet in early April, that particular stillness before the season actually turns. Cold still in the air, but something loosening underneath it. I thought about who my grandfather had been. Not the program, not the deniable operations, not the careful bureaucratic thank you letter. The man who called me every birthday without fail. The man who made too much tortillere and gave half of it away. The man who sat in his kitchen with a small embroidered patch in his hand and let me see it once without explaining, because he trusted me to understand eventually. I tucked the patch into my jacket pocket. I still carry it with me, not because it's proof of anything, not because I want to hold on to the secret, but because it reminds me what it looks like when someone spends their whole life giving what they have without keeping a record of it. My grandfather never asked to be recognized. He never asked to be recognized. He just did the work, whatever the work was, in whatever room he was in, and left quietly. I think about him on the bus to work sometimes. I think about him when I'm in a meeting and someone gets loud to make their point. I think about him when I see an older person sitting alone at a family gathering. The quiet one. The one who doesn't push for the center of the room. I lean in now when those people speak. I ask questions. I wait. My parents have changed in small ways. My father volunteers at the Legion now, one Saturday a month. He doesn't talk about it much. He just goes. My mother started keeping a better record of the family. Not just photos, but stories. Asking relatives about things they remember, writing them down. She told me recently that she found a letter my grandfather had written to his own mother in the 1960s from somewhere he wasn't supposed to say. It was full of small things, what the weather was like, what he'd had for breakfast, the way the light looked in the late afternoon. He was always paying attention, she said. I just didn't know what he was paying attention to. I know now. He was paying attention to the same things he always paid attention to. The ordinary beauty of being alive, the small moments that don't get written down but matter anyway. The cardinal on the fence. The light in the afternoon. A granddaughter who drove 4.5 hours in the middle of the night without being asked. He knew I was paying attention too. He just waited, quietly, to be understood.